Hi, my name is Andy Rasman. This video is looking at the 7-year tribulation in Revelation. The last video in this series showed how Revelation can be read linearly or cyclically. And if you read it linearly, you have a 7-year actual period of time at the end of the age after the rapture of the church. I guess there's some people put the trib before the rapture. It's wild, man. It's wild. But then there's also a cyclical view, nonlinear view reading of Revelation. And there we do not have a 7-year tribulation. We only have a 3.5-year period of time, which is mentioned more than once in Revelation. And so, what do people make of the 3.5 year if they have that? And people that believe in a 7-year trib, how do they get that number from the book of Revelation? So it's the dispensationalists that hold to a concept of a 7-year tribulation. They get that from Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. So they go outside Revelation to get this kick started for them. They see a final week of a 70-week prophecy interpreted as a future 7-year period. So in Daniel 9:27, it mentions a covenant being broken halfway through this week, leading them to divide the tribulation into two 3.5-year periods. This division is supported by time references in Revelation 11, verses 2 to 3, chapter 12, verse 6, and chapter 13, verse 5, which speaks of 1,260 days or 42 months, both equating to 3.5 years. So the first 3.5 years are seen as a period of relative peace, while the second 3.5 years are understood as the Great Tribulation. I don't think any are relative peace, but definitely the back end here, 3.5 years, is a ratcheting up of wrath as the Antichrist does his thing. Together, these passages form the basis for a split tribulation period and dispensationalist understanding of the end times. So dispensationalists, they don't add all the 3.5-year time periods that are found in Revelation together. They see Daniel 9:27, look that up and read it. It speaks of a final week interpreted as 7 years and a prophecy of 70 weeks. So the first 3.5 years of the tribulation they see as being referred to in Revelation 11, 2 to 3, and 12:6. So those two time periods are the same time period, referring to the same 3.5 years. And then they see Revelation 13:5 identified as the Great Tribulation, a period of intensified suffering under the Antichrist. And both halves come together to make 7 years. Dispensationalists. You can see the 7 seals they consider to be part of the 7-year tribulation. You saw that in the linear timeline, but you don't see the 3.5 years mentioned until chapter 11. All right, so most dispensationalists then include the 7 seals as part of the tribulation. All right, so they consider the opening of the seals in Revelation 6 as part of the tribulation period itself. They typically view the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls as 3 sets of time in which calamity is coming down upon the earth, divine wrath and judgment. So the question then becomes, what do you make of the 3.5 years if you do not believe in a linear view? All right, so from the nonlinear cyclical view of Revelation, which is understanding Revelation as a book of apocalyptic literature, that this is a feature within apocalyptic literature, that the 7 cycles that we see, the seals, the trumpets, and bowls, are all the same time period. That means we see the 3.5 years in the cyclical view of Revelation being the same time period. All right, now let me give you a list of those. Revelation 11:2, we see the outer court of the temple will be trampled for 42 months. Revelation 11:3, the 2 witnesses prophesy for 1,260 days. Revelation 12:6, the woman is protected from the dragon's attack for 1,260 days. Revelation 12:14, the same woman is protected by God for a time and times and a half a time, which is 3.5 years in Greek speak. Then you got Revelation 13:5. The beast from the sea will afflict the woman and her seed for 42 months. Again, 3.5-year period. So the apocalyptic cyclical view of time sees all of those time periods I just named as representing the same period of time. Now, watch the last video. I talked about chiasms. So in a chiastic fashion, the first two depictions are of God's enemies attacking God's people for 42 months. They sandwich the two depictions of God protecting his people for 1,260 days. So why is the same time period designated differently? 42 months, 1,260 days, 3.5 years. Short answer, we don't know. Why 3.5 years? We don't know, but there's a lot we can consider as to why 3.5 years is listed here. The drought and famine in Elijah's day was for 3.5 years. That's in 1 Kings 17:1, 18:1, and verses 42 to 45. So 3.5 years of drought under the days of Elijah. And the days of Elijah were nasty, horrible days where it seemed like it was the end for God's people. But was it? No, it wasn't. God's people survived. They came through. The time could reference the roughly 3.5 years that Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated and controlled the temple of God in between the Old Testament and New Testament. That could also be something drawn up here. The Jews would have had that quite in mind for themselves. Also, the receivers of this book might have thought of the Jewish War from 67 to 70 AD. That's about a 3.5 year period, maybe 3 year period, that ended with the destruction of God's temple. The time of wandering, this is pretty interesting. The time of wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus was for 40 years. And before entering the promised land was 2 years. So you have a 42-year period from the Exodus to when they enter the promised land. So could those years be represented here as 42 months? It shows God's people wandering through the wilderness of this world, the problems of this world, in which we are protected by God and brought into that new heaven, new earth. Maybe that's the 42 months, what we could be thinking of. A number to signify God's established time of sovereignty would be 7 years, 7 days of creation, 7 years. We talked about that. 7 as a symbolic number for God's, for God, right? So the 7 churches, right? The 7 seals. This is God having sovereignty over what unfolds in terms of the havoc and wrath of the 7 seals. So 7 years would be a good God-established time of sovereignty. So 3.5 years is only a portion of that time. In fact, it is half of that time. If the 3.5 years depicted here is, as apocalyptic literature understands, from the ascension of Christ to his return, this would be the New Testament era of God's people, 3.5 years. So the other 3.5 years would be the Old Testament era of God's people. Put them together, this is 7 years for God's people, right? The time in which God has us here on earth. So anyways, that is the 7 years, and the nonlinear view we're taking sees this as a symbolic 3.5 years, just as the 1,000-year period is also symbolic. We'll get into all this as we go through it verse by verse.